we are in the middle of a scientific reformation. The Protestants are out there, and they reject the authority of the scientific church. Yeah. And now the challenge is how quickly can we organize a counter-reformation? And that is what I will be advocating for, and I would love to form some sort of community of people like you and John Haidt and David Sloan Wilson and Seligman and Dweck and all that sort of stuff. I think we need to organize an effective counter-reformation, because the problem is that standing outside of science as one of the lay people, there is not a lot of doctrinal clarity. I brought up the diffusion of innovations, for example, and you hadn't even heard of it. And that seems like it's like a really big problem. And you're not the only one, by the way. I mean, I've talked about this before on this podcast. So David Sloan Wilson, who's the big sort of multi-level selection guy. So he was concerned about the movement of ideas, and he wanted to do a conference. He wanted to do EvoCon, which, of course, is a culturally appropriate response for a scientist to come up with. We're going to have a conference, and it's going to be great. And it seemed a little nuts to Brian and I, because that's not really how people move ideas in sort of the average world. We were like, okay. And he sends me this 66-page paper towards evolving a science of intentional behavior change. And I read it, and I was like, aren't you talking about how to move ideas? And didn't Everett Rogers already write a book on this in 1967? And he said, of course, I've heard of Everett Rogers' book, but I haven't made a close study of it. And I'm like, oh, so you never read it.
Yeah.
But he was literally about to go off and try and solve this problem that had already been solved.
Yeah, and I think this is happening in the academy, and I think you're right. We're now engaged in two different things, right? Mm-hmm. One is we do science, and we have to solve the scientific issues in peer review and not in public writings and so forth. And sometimes intellectual debates spin out into blogs, and kind of are on balance a little bit counterproductive. But we do need a society of individuals who are about the dissemination of scientific ideas, right? That that have the talent to write in ways that get our ideas out in for broader public consumption.
Right.
It's funny. My friend Michael Lewis, the writer, he's got a book coming out on Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, and he read all these scientific papers, and he's like, "You guys are so funny. You write papers so people won't read them."
Yeah.
So I'm with you, and I think it's starting to happen, and this would be a good movement to catalyze.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the other thing too, and I think something that I only realized again when I left the academy, is that it's important to realize that once upon a time, science was a startup. It was great, and it was nimble, and it was all these sorts of things. And now it is a large, unwieldy bureaucracy.
It's a big bureaucracy.
Yeah. The reality is that as humans, there are naturally cultural biases.
Yeah,
and
massive.
One of the big cultural biases is a bias towards a style of writing that does not actually move ideas and doesn't fit with what we know about how ideas move. Yeah. And then the other big one, I think, as well, is this tendency towards atomism. These Western notions of let's pick everything apart and get smaller and smaller and smaller have been allowed to run wild. And there needs to be, I think, in the sort of perspective that I've come to is that optimism and pessimism are complementary perspectives. And the same thing is true for atomism and holism. Yeah. And so I think within the academy, there also needs to be some sort of role for people who are deliberate synthesizers. I mean, physics has that. So why can't we have a theory of everything human?
Yeah. And, the great scientific advances are founded on that. Think about Darwin. Yeah. And he would write books about mollusks and the finch's beaks. And at the same time, he had this holistic, synthetic, almost East Asian female way of looking at putting all these facts into a narrative. Right. So absolutely. I am with you 100%. And I'm going to my computer after we talk to start being more synthetic.
That sounds great. Well, the thing that we've been doing on this podcast is we've been doing what's called mixed mental arts, which is deliberately to be synthetic because my sort of experience after I had my great humiliating experience of realizing that actors understood the human brain better than I did, was that I went out and I sort of essentially do you know Rule 34?
Rule 34.
Of the internet.
I don't.
So Rule 34 of the internet is, if you can imagine it, there is porn of it. And I'm going to tell you that my experience is that there's sort of a corollary to Rule 34, which if you can imagine it, there is science of it. Literally, I was like, oh, how do ideas move? And then I look it up and, oh, there's Everett Rogers. That exists. Yeah. And in field after field after field, when you go and you just sort of apply Rule 34, you're like, yeah, somebody already studied that 5 decades ago. And, nobody ever bothered to put it together. So I think the time is right. And I think that one of the best things that the Academy can do between now and 2020 is to stitch together that theory of everything. Because there's a good portion of the population that is still loyal to science, still has intuitions of authority about science. And with that doctrinal clarity, I mean, science gives us power over reality. And if you have that clear understanding, then that's the thing that's going to allow you to beat the shit out of Trump.
And I am already getting emails from a lot of my colleagues who are very devoted to that idea. This was a humbling election, right? For the rationalist social scientist type. Our polls were wrong.
Right.
The election proved to be wrong. We just miscalculated and mispredicted. All of us were wrong.
Right.
So now it's time to sharpen and get clear.
And to do that Counter-Reformation.
Yeah, exactly.